The Yedida Kalfon Stillman Memorial Lecture was established in honor and in memory of Yedida Kalfon Stillman, a beloved teacher, mentor, and world-renowned scholar who died February 1998. Born in Morocco and raised in Israel, Yedida and Noam Stillman worked together for many years at Binghamton University in New York State, and then together founded the Judaic Studies program here at OU. Yedida authored several of the definitive studies in her field, including Arab headdress from the birth of Islam to modern times. Her works are still being read, cited, and even published by Noam Stillman, now residing in Jerusalem with Dina Asseline Stillman since their retirement in 2015. A sampler of Yedida Kalfon Stillman's many publications are displayed on the counter right over here, and I invite you all to take a moment after the lecture to peruse them. This Yedida Kalfon Stillman lecture is very special on a few grounds. While not all of our recent YKS lecturers knew Yedida personally, tonight's speaker did, and he's also a close colleague of Noam Stillman, our program's founder. Professor Luis Cortest has served OU in Modern Languages, Literature, and Linguistics Department since the late 1980s, 1987, with distinction for many years, including chairing that department from 1992 to 1999. Among Professor Cortest's many writings are a critical edition of the Arte para Servir a Dios by Fray Alonso de Madrid, The Disfigured Face, Traditional Natural Law and Its Encounter with Modernity, a study of medieval and early modern natural law traditions. He published a modern edition of the 16th century Regimento de la Vida by the famed Jewish travelogue writer Moshe Almos Nino, and most recently, Philo's heirs, Moses Maimonides and Thomas Aquinas. For those of us lucky enough to call him a friend, we know Luis to be an active intellect in both classic texts and also a very savvy commentator on current events, local and international. If I ever want to know anything about what's going on at OU, this is who I call. Luis is appreciated deeply by all of his colleagues, not only in modern literature, languages, and linguistics, but also in Judaic studies. He has been a long-time supporter, participant, and contributor, as he has to many quarters of this university, among them the Department of Religious Studies. And on behalf of the Religious Studies Department, Professor Marie Dallum, the acting chair, in the New Horizons series initiated by Charles Kimball and executed by Ms. Lee Green, I would like to ask Marie to come up here and to present Professor Cortest with a little gift. So Marie?
Yes, thank you. In Religious Studies, we have a series of lectures called the New Horizons in Religious Studies lectures. They're celebrating new publications that are related to religious studies, and because we didn't quite get our act together, we didn't sponsor a lecture for Luis in time, and we discovered this semester when we wanted to do it, he was already doing this. So, Alan was generous enough to allow us to give him this gift. Please, Luis, come up. This is on behalf of Religious Studies.
Thank you.
You're welcome.
I'm going to go ahead and open this. And it's a beautiful, beautiful frame. Yeah, please. So, Marie, thank you very much for the gift for Luis on his behalf. And without further ado, let me introduce Professor Luis Cortest.
Well, let me begin with a question. Can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay, because if you can, I'm not sure I'll even use the microphone. I may walk over there from time to time, but I like to keep things lively. First of all, I want to say that it would be hard for me to express what an honor this is to be here. I'm moved to think about it because I am very, very interested in Judaic studies, as some of you may know. I'm not Jewish, and for me it's a double honor to be asked to give this wonderful talk. I want to say that I did know Yedida, and she worked in our department for a year. Later, she went to history. Sadly, she became very ill soon after that, and of course, we lost her. But Noam was, for me, an inspiration. There was never a time when I didn't speak with him, when I didn't learn something new. He was just like a walking encyclopedia of Judaica. He was also, for me, one of the most welcoming people. Very few people on this campus have been or were as kind to me as he was. He opened the door for me right away. When I first came to OU in 1987, I had just participated in an NEH, National Endowment for the Humanities, summer seminar in New York City. Actually, it was in the Bronx at Fordham University. And some of you may be snickering. Yes, there might be a difference to some of you, but not to me, since I'm not from there. But I had the great pleasure of studying with a man named Joseph O'Callahan, wonderful historian of medieval Spain. And there were other participants. Angus Mackay was there from Scotland. And we had this amazing summer. And each of the people who was participating was supposed to take on a special topic. And it was at that time, this is 1987, that I said to Joe O'Callahan, I said, I would like to work on the Jews of Spain. And he said, oh, that sounds like something that could be very beneficial to the group. Why don't you go ahead and do that? It sounds exciting. And I started to work right then. And I have never stopped. I really got into the subject. Some of you know that I can probably even be a little bit obsessive when I get into a subject. And I started studying very hard. And also, there at that wonderful institute, we were given also special permission to work in Columbia's library. We had a free pass to go to Columbia. So after a while, after I'd worked for a while at Fordham, I started going to Columbia every day. And I started thinking, you know, not only am I working on Judaica, I'm living Judaica. When you would walk into that library at Columbia and start looking at the collection in Judaica, you realize this is a library. This is not just another library. And in many ways, for me, that experience was unforgettable. Now, one of two stories I plan to tell. Yesterday, I had the wonderful experience of talking to a physician who was here in the United States from Chile, visiting. He had given a talk to an international audience in San Diego about his research. He was a featured speaker. My good friend Marcelo Rioseco in my own department wanted me to meet this wonderful person, Glenn Hernandez. And Glenn came to my office and we were talking, and he said, so Marcelo tells me that you are interested in medieval subjects. When did you become interested? And I said, I've always been interested. I hadn't thought about that. When did I start? And then it took me back, and then I remembered when I first started. It was when I had a teacher as an undergraduate who was the most incredible teacher. His name was Lynn Warren Winchett. He was a philologist. He'd been trained in Spain, and at that time, the University of Wisconsin-Madison, a magnificent center for study. He was one of the prize students of Lloyd Kasten. He had known the medievalists from the 50s and the 60s there at Wisconsin. He'd known many people. And he took me under his wing. I was just a sophomore in college, and he said, you know, I'll work with you as much as you want. You seem to be very interested in this. I ended up practically becoming a stepson. I worked with him all the time. We would spend weekends together studying, and I was learning about the Middle Ages, and he would tell me, look, you need to read these books. These are key books for anyone who studies the Middle Ages. And I would get the book, start studying, and then we would talk about each book. And this went on for a couple of years. And then he said, it'd be, you know, I want you to follow in my footsteps. Yeah, I don't think he said it in those words, but it was sort of like, I want you to have the wonderful experience I had at the University of Wisconsin-Madison, and I want you to go there. And I had planned to go to Wisconsin right after graduating from my alma mater, Wichita State University. And Wichita will come up later in the talk, I promise. So I said, oh, that's wonderful. But in the meantime, I got an international fellowship to study in Spain. And that experience really was transformative for me, because there I had a chance to study with the great medievalist Rafael Lapesa, who was teaching at the Complutense de Madrid. So that was an experience that was transformative for me. Then I came back. I went to Wisconsin. I was there for a couple of years. Wisconsin was going through the change that so many universities were going through at the time. The older generation was retiring. A new generation was coming on the scene with a different perspective. The old school was sort of fading away. I could tell when I was there that I was at a place where there had been some very serious scholars. I could tell. I'd heard about Merle Curry in the history department. I'd heard about other people, many people there. But the department I had hoped to study in, that energy that I hoped to experience there was fading fast. So I decided to change, and I was very fortunate to move on to the University of California, Berkeley, which is a place I have a very I have a very high opinion of that university, even though, and now people who know me know this already, I know that Professor Anderson's sitting there waiting for the punchline. In all those years of studying medieval studies with my great teacher, with the people of Wisconsin, and later with the people at Berkeley, there was hardly a mention of Al-Andalus. If you look at your page, hardly a mention of Islamic Spain. It was all about these works of vernacular literature that I could have read the canon of medieval Spanish literature is so small that I could have probably read the whole thing in a semester. I can assure you I did. I could have taken those exams right after I got my master's. There wasn't that much there. It wasn't that exciting to me. And I longed for something that was missing. Something that was missing in my training. And I just said, well, I wonder what's wrong with me. This doesn't excite me. I can't get into this anymore. And then I discovered a subject that just, for me, was the most wonderful subject. And that subject was natural law. This is it for me. I love this subject because it enabled me to continue studying the things I've been studying already, the works of Thomas Aquinas, the medieval philosophers, works of theology, and most of all, the whole panorama of natural law. In studying natural law, those precepts that must be, that we glean studying the way things work in nature. It's teleological view of the world, Aristotelian especially. The Stoics also have a long tradition of natural law. But studying that tradition and studying the Christian scholastics, especially Thomas Aquinas, led me to a Jewish thinker. And you already know where I'm going, but this is how I got there. I discovered Moses Maimonides. And that for me was one of the most wonderful discoveries when I started reading the works of Maimonides, and especially one, and you know which one that was, the guide for the perplexed. And I prepared this, I thought I did a good job with this handout. You're going to see what I'm talking about. All these names I mentioned should be on here, starting now. I started studying the works of Maimonides, and I realized right away, man, you don't have the background to study this. You need to learn way more than you know now before you can begin to talk about this. The one thing you have to do is you have to learn a little bit about the medieval Islamic thinkers. So I started studying them one by one after the other, so that I could begin to understand Maimonides. And then I started looking at the Shlomo Pinez translation, and I said, I can't stand this translation. And many people have said to me, you know, it's wonderful, that 2-volume translation. Oh, that's the best translation. That's the one you have to use, Luis. Stick with the Pinez and you're going to be all right. I just couldn't do it. I would read a sentence and say, this can't be, this has got to be wrong. This has got to be wrong. And then, okay, I don't want to ruin the talk, but 30 years later, Lynn Goodman told me, in these words, Lynn Goodman of Vanderbilt, he said, I'm preparing a translation of the guide. I can't stand reading that Pinez translation any longer. I can't stand it for another day. And he spent years working on a new translation of the Guide for the Perplexed. And I just thought, this is wonderful. Finally, somebody understands my perspective. So to get back to my friend from Chile, he said, well, so when did you discover the Middle Ages? Well, it feels now at my age like I've studied the medieval period all my life. It's really not been all my life. It's only been 45 years. But it's been a while. It takes a while to learn. And one of the things that I think I've learned studying the Middle Ages, and now this is more, this may be idea one I hope to share, is that for me there are two types of medievalists. And this is a gross oversimplification, but this is what I firmly believe. There are those who look forward and those who look backward. I was trained by someone who taught me how to look back. My first real effort in medieval studies was, I wrote a pretty long undergraduate honors thesis on Alfonso el Sabio. On your page, Alfonso X, called Alfonso the Wise, and it was about the Grande General Historia and the classical sources in that work. And I just thought, learning about this, I would get so excited because I would tell my friend Lynn Winchett, I'd say, what's all this about the rebirth of the classics in the 16th century? What's all this about this Renaissance BS? It's not true. You find these classical writers all over the place. Page after page after page of Ovid being cited by Alfonso or other classical writers. Oh, this long, long history that includes all these classical references to all kinds of classical texts. And I said, why do people think that there weren't any classical authors, or that somehow one day someone woke up and said, here we are. I'm sure Pico de la Mirandola thought that. You know, I'm sure that the Renaissance humanists who coined the term Middle Ages, that ugly period between the classics and us, where there was nothing. No, that is not true. So I discovered, no. If you study medieval authors and you look back, you can see so much. You can discover so much. Okay, which brings me to one of the most important scholars I've ever studied. I actually teach this. I teach a book in my history of Spanish mysticism class. It's Gershom Scholom's book, Major Trends. There it is on your page. Major Trends. That book is one of the most important books in the academic study of Kabbalah, tradition, Jewish mysticism, Kabbalah. It's one of the masterpieces. Gershom Scholem said there was a writer once who lived in Spain, who had lived in Guadalajara, and he spent his last years in the walled city of Avila, called by Spanish Jews the Spanish Jerusalem. And if you've ever seen Avila in the distance when you're coming in on a bus, it looks a little bit like Jerusalem. You can kind of see how it looks like the old city. I know Alan's going to take a group there this summer. Remember the story about Moshe de Leon. And so Gershom Scholem, the great Gershom Scholem, his real name was Gerhard. But he was a Zionist and he changed his name to Gershom because he did not want to be another assimilated Jew like his father. In fact, he ended up leaving home and he spent really the rest of his life studying Judaic, learning about it, and studying Kabbalah and the history of it. But Scholem looks forward. He says, Moshe de Leon surely was the author of the Zohar. And that text would have such an impact that it would transform Judaism. Because that kind of reading, that kind of exegetical exercise, would be the very thing that would open the door for someone like Nathan of Gaza, who would write and argue that Shabbatai Zvi was the Messiah. This is transformative in the history of Judaism. The whole story of Shabbatai Zvi, of the thousands of people who followed him and listened to the exegete, who wrote about how this was really the Messiah, Nathan of Gaza. How did he do it? Reading as if he were reading Kabbalah. All layers of mystical reading, layer after layer of allegorical, mystical reading. So Scholem said this is where it all started. And as much as I admire Scholem, and I have to say that his book on Shabbatai Zvi, The Mystical Messiah, is one of the greatest masterpieces for me, historical scholarship in Judaic. I don't agree with him because no, I can't imagine that Moshe de Leon wrote the Zohar. If ever there was a tradition that includes oral tradition, if ever there was a community that has as part of its essence, almost its identity, the oral tradition, oral Torah, oral tradition, it's the Jewish community. I don't believe for 1 minute that Moshe de Leon was the author of the Book of Splendor, Zohar. I don't believe it for a second. Why not? Because it's clear that this piece, if you look at it from the point of view of a medievalist who looks backwards, what you see is this is coming after hundreds and hundreds of years of tradition. He's a compiler, perhaps, who comes at a very, very important moment. Very, very important moment in the history of the Jewish people. If you'll see my handout, he's almost a contemporary of my king I worked on, Alfonso X. Am I right or wrong from your page? See, I don't even have to look at the page. I've got it down. I promise you. There you are. And I, of course, am thinking, so Moshe de Leon lives in Guadalajara and he moves to Avila. And he lives about the same time as Alfonso. My study of Alfonso, the time I've spent with Alfonso, is all I look back. And the tradition, the foundation for Zohar is an oral tradition. If you'd like, it's an esoteric tradition. And it's a tradition that wasn't supposed to be open to the public. It was never supposed to get to Madonna. It was supposed to be secretive, and it was supposed to be only for those people who were over 30 years old and had studied, who could handle this, who wouldn't be like the lost souls who were with Rabbi Akiva. Remember this story? What happens to this group? It's kind of a mystery story. This group that goes in to study, one dies, another becomes an apostate. Right. Another becomes delirious, and one comes out Rabbi Akiva. When you study something as, I would say, profound, with as many layers of meaning as Zohar, this is not for the uninitiated. This is not for the uninitiated. This isn't for me. This is for people who have studied and have learned and have had the opportunity to study with masters for many, many years. And then this should be handled very gently. It's the opposite of what we do at universities, right? We just throw people in there and say, "You ready to go, baby?" No. This is not the way it works. This is not the way it works. And you can be sure that in Jewish tradition, you didn't touch these things. You didn't touch Kabbalah. You didn't touch any of this until you were ready. You are supposed to always work with a master. You work with a master you've taught. You find a teacher. You know, some of you know Elie Wiesel. He told a good friend of mine, David Patterson, that he had been studying Torah with Sho Lieberman for like 20 years. Every week. Every week. That's how you study. You find someone, you find a teacher. In my case, it was the blind leading the blind. I wanted to learn about all this, but I didn't really have a teacher who could teach me, so I taught myself. And I used the tools I had to help me understand someone like Stillman, of course, his whole take on the mystical tradition. I did have this advantage. I had done my dissertation on the Spanish mystics. But when we studied the Spanish mystics, when I was in graduate school, you never mentioned any Jewish figure. There were no Jews. We studied the Christians. We studied St. Teresa of Avila, St. John of the Cross, a couple more. By the time I finished writing my dissertation on Alonso de Madrid, I could name every mystic. I knew like catalogs of names of Spanish mystics. But I hadn't studied the Jewish mystics. The Jewish mystical tradition is rich. It's rich, and it did not start with Moshe de Leon. Another scholar is a scholar who looks back when he studies the Middle Ages. Sholem actually did his dissertation on a medieval author, and so did Harry A. Wolfson. He started off as a medievalist. This is good, you know, he started off as a medievalist, he had it right from the beginning. But he looked back. He would later look forward as well, but he looked back and he said, let's go back to where? Let's go back to where this all came from. He said, let's go back. Maimonides. Not just Maimonides. Let's look at some of the other medieval writers. Let's look at Ibn Gabirol, even Judah Halevi. Let's look at the book of tradition. Let's look at Ibn Daud. Let's look back. And all these roads took him back to one name. And that was Philo of Alexandria. Philo of Alexandria. And when I discovered this in Wolfson, I just said, this has got to be, this has to be something I study. This must be something important, and I have to study it. There's proof of it right there. Now it just looks like an essay. I want to tell you, when you study someone like Philo, the first thing you have to do is read his works. And he was not an author who wrote only one book or two, or we have two fragments, or no. He wrote a lot. We're blessed to have Philo because Philo's works, to a large extent, were preserved. This is not usually the case, right? When we talk about an author from his time, and I have his dates, I have him there listed and so on. What was it about this Philo? Well, I first started reading his works, and the first thing I said to myself when I started reading his Life of Moses was, why couldn't I have studied this when I was studying classics? I know some of my friends, I know Scott Johnson has heard me say this, and I think he's probably a little bit offended by the way I talk about it. They made me read Virgil, I tell them. Of course it was good for me. Virgil, they made me read works that were, that's not what I wanted to study. That's not what I wanted to study. I did it because I had to do it. That's why my Latin was never anything like Roberto Bescius, who's here today, from our medieval, he's our medievalist in Italian. I couldn't learn Latin at that level. When I started reading Philo, and I said, I could have learned Latin at that level if I had read Philo, because Philo to me was the most exciting writer I think in some ways I had ever read. The most amazing writer, this allegorical interpretation, in him are married Athens and Jerusalem. Who talked about this? Has anyone ever heard someone say, Athens, Jerusalem, Athens? You've heard it 100 times, I'm sure. Do you remember a writer who actually, a scholar who surely knew Gershom Scholem, was from the same world, had studied in Germany, and would write about Maimonides, and later Spinoza, Leo Strauss. The wonderful Leo Strauss. I know that my good friend Kyle Harper says, how could you read that? And I tell him, I said, to me, this is the guy who has something to say. That little book, Persecution and the Art of Writing, that is the most incredible book. It's about the size of my book, only the difference is that one is a book. That book is going to last a long time. Yes. Leo Strauss. Leo Strauss is fascinated by Maimonides. In fact, he wrote an introduction to the Shlomo Pinez's introduction to Maimonides' guide. It's about 90 pages, but the pages are that big and the letter is that small. So it's like a 200-page book. It's like the introduction. An incredible story, because he's writing about Maimonides and trying to put Maimonides in a kind of historical context, but he's also saying Maimonides in his own way was writing for the people who had enough learning not to be scandalized by allegorical interpretation. The way you explain Scripture to people who are literalists, if you want to make sense of this, is you have to explain things metaphorically. Now, I'm not here to say, oh, I've discovered a direct link from Philo to Maimonides. That's not going to happen. It's not going to happen to me. I'll never be so lucky. But I can tell you this. When you begin to look back at the works of Philo, and you begin to consider some of the subjects he considered, and I recommend my book, you see that subjects as important as divine attributes, apophatic theology, negative theology, very important in Philo. His account of creation, his important consideration of providence, natural law, and prophecy, this is all in Maimonides. It's not only in Maimonides, it's all over the place. You begin to see that Wolfson, who once made this claim, he said, Philo changed the way philosophy would be done for 17 centuries. Let me repeat that. He said that Philo of Alexandria, changed the way philosophy would be done for 17 centuries. What did he mean exactly? This is what he meant. After Philo, especially Christian writers, and especially Christian writers from Alexandria, like Clement of Alexandria on your page, or Origen. How do you like the way I describe Origen? Don't I say, one of the greatest theologians of his day, or any day? I believe that. These are people who follow that model. They follow Philo's model. This is the way. This is the way we talk about divine things. This is the way we talk about revealed religion when it's combined with philosophy, when it's informed by philosophy, when philosophy and philosophical principles guide our consideration of biblical texts. Now, bad news and good news for you. I don't see a clock. The good news is, Mr. Potter. Yes. Keep me going here. Got it. I want you to just look at a couple texts, very briefly. Philonic texts. These are from Philo. The first one in your handout comes from On the Life of Moses. For some persons say, and not without some reason and propriety, that this is the only way by which cities can be expected to advance in improvement. If either the kings cultivate philosophy, or philosophers exercise the kingly power. But Moses will be seen not only to have displayed all these powers, I mean the genius of the philosopher and of the king in an extraordinary degree, at the same time, but three other powers likewise, one of which is conversant about legislation, the second about the way of discharging the duties of high priest, and the last about the prophetic office. And it is on these subjects that I have now been constrained to choose to enlarge. For I conceive that all these things have fitly been united in him, in Moses, inasmuch as in accordance with the providential will of God, he was both a king and a lawgiver, and a high priest and a prophet, and became in each office he displayed the most eminent wisdom and virtue. And because in each office he displayed the most eminent wisdom and virtue. Moses was, for Philo, the greatest philosopher, the teacher of truth. He didn't forget Moses. What philosopher does this remind us of who talks about philosopher king? It's Plato, of course. Philo is in the Platonic tradition. Very much so. Called by some people a Middle Platonist. But as I point out in my book, he's way more than just a Middle Platonist. Way more than that. He's the Middle Platonist who brings together Athens and Jerusalem. He's the Middle Platonist. When he talks about philosopher king, of course he's inspired by Plato. Of course you think Plato when you read it. But one of the things he wanted to do was focus on the centrality of Moses. He said, Moses, 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 and don't forget Moses. When you forget Moses, this is what happens. You become Sigmund Freud. We know what happened to him. You can't do that. He didn't want the Gentile world to forget Moses. When he writes on natural law, he says, yes, many societies have law. The Greeks had laws. The Romans have laws, but not like our laws. But not like our laws, because our laws are the foundation of all other laws. Think about that. He brought that into his writing. He wasn't writing for Jews. In fact, some people will say, knowledgeable people, he had little impact on Jewish writers. May be true, but I can tell you this. The way of doing philosophy, the method, the allegorical reading of Scripture combined with Greek philosophy, all strains. You see in him Stoicism, you see Aristotle, and you see Plato. Especially when he talks about creation. Why? Because he had the model right in front of him. He had the Greek Scripture, the Septuagint, and standing right next to it was the Timaeus of Plato. And if you've ever put those texts together right next to each other, the Timaeus, look at the Timaeus and look at the Greek, the Jewish Bible in Greek, the Septuagint, you're amazed how similar they look. So similar that Moses, according to Philo, surely influenced Plato. Surely Plato knew about Moses. How else could it have been so similar? He believed this for centuries. His way of doing philosophy was the way. Let's look at another quote. This comes from another work. I promise not to go on much longer, but I can't let you go without sharing the joy of reading some Philo. I don't see very well, so I'm going to have to stand over here in the light. Moses thinks that one should incline neither to the right, nor to the left, nor to any part of earthly adornment at all, but to pass by along the middle road, which he most properly calls the royal road, from Numbers. For since God is the first and sole king of the universe, the road leading to him, being a king's road, is also rightly called royal. This road you must hold to be philosophy. Not that which is pursued by the contemporary crowd of sophists, who, having practiced the art of speech in opposition to the truth, call their sophistry wisdom, assigning a divine title to a miserable work. It is rather the philosophy that the ancient band of devotees achieved with great effort of turning aside from the bland charms of pleasure, elegantly and rigorously engaged in the study of the good. This royal road, then, which we have said to be true and authentic philosophy, is called by the law the utterance and word of God. For it is written, you shall not turn away from the word which I command you this day, to the right or to the left, Deuteronomy. Thus it is clearly demonstrated that the word of God is identical with the royal road. If namely he exhorts us to turn away neither from the word of God nor the royal way, as being synonymous, but with upright mind to advance on the straightforward path, a central roadway. There, clear illustration of this union, Athens, Jerusalem. That's what Philo did. That's why Philo matters. Because Philo was the one who established the way philosophy would be done for many, many centuries. My last story. I was thinking before I came, oh, what a different world I came from, Noam Stillman. It's funny if you know the story. I mean, a completely different world. Yet he and I would talk, and it was so exciting to me to be able to talk to someone who knew so much about what I found so interesting. And I started looking back, and I remembered when I first discovered the world of the Jews. This goes back to about 1962. I was trying to place it. I was thinking before I came, when did I first encounter anything Jewish? It was when I was growing up in Wichita, Kansas, in the years after and before, after the age of segregation, and before the age of civil rights, I still remember mostly a segregated city. The public schools were the black schools were named Tucson Louverture and Paul Laurence Dunbar. Think of how many cities around the country had a Dunbar school. A Louverture, the black Catholic Church, segregated, was St. Peter Claver, named after a Spanish saint, the missionary to Colombia, the Cartagena de Indias. I can still remember. My father would take me with him everywhere. In a Chicano family, if you're the only boy, you're like the only child. And I remember he was rare in this way. He did not believe, nor could he ever believe or accept segregation. And I remember going with him to what I would call now a black salvage yard. And the salvage yards were especially segregated. Because if you ever have spent any time in salvage yards, which my wife can assure you, I never stop going to salvage yards, and I hope I never do. They are among the most segregated places of all, because talk about a group of rednecks. And we were at this black salvage yard. I'm going to call it that, all black. And this man came up to my father and he said, "Can I help you?" And my father told him what he needed, so they went off together. And I was about 10 years old. And this young, probably a black teenager walked up to me. He was probably a teenager, and he said, "Can I show you something?" And I said, "Yes." And he walked over to a big black car that was parked there, that had been salvaged, that had been left there. And he said, "This car belonged to Jews." And I said, "How do you know that?" He says, "Let me show you." And he opened the back door, and behind the back seat, there was a refrigerator. And it's, "See this?" he said. "This is where Jews keep their meat." And I said, "You're kidding." He said, "No, when they travel, they have to take their meat with them, because their meat has to be prepared in a very special way." From that moment on, I was fascinated by Judaic. I was fascinated by Judaic. And if we had more time, I would give you a Philonic reading of how important that moment was for me. But I'll conclude with just a couple of sentences. It's not an accident that that car was there at that salvage yard. Because if there was one group in Wichita, Kansas that never accepted segregation, it was the Jews. Whenever there was a discussion on local TV about civil rights, there would always be a rabbi there. He was always sitting there saying, "This is wrong. This is wrong. This is wrong." Why? If we go back to Philo, one of the few facts we know about Philo is that he was the ambassador from his community in Alexandria, which would have been the largest city in the diaspora. It was New York at its time. But the persecution of the Jews was very strong there. He was the one sent to meet with Gaius Caligula, a monster, to try to ask for tolerance. Because no people has a history of persecution and segregation longer than the Jews. That car wasn't there by accident. It was left there by someone who didn't believe in that lie that is so much a part of our history. Thank you.